A washed-up former champion boxer named Marcus Cole stands before his bathroom mirror, staring at the reflection of a man who has given up, bags under his eyes, a gut where abs used to be, and a spirit so broken that even his own daughter's birthday card sits unopened on the counter. He's been numbing himself with whiskey for 3 years, since the accident that ended his career. But tonight, for reasons he cannot articulate, he looks at his fists, still scarred, still capable, and something ancient and primal stirs in his chest. A question that will not be silenced. What if I'm not done? Marcus gets a call from his ex, wife that his 14-year-old daughter Maya has been hospitalized after a suicide attempt. She left a note that simply read, "Dad stopped fighting, so I stopped too." The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the sternum. He realizes his quitting wasn't just his own defeat. It became permission for everyone who loved him to quit on themselves. In the hospital hallway, he makes a vow to Maya's unconscious form. "I'll show you what it means to get back up. I don't care if it takes every breath I have left." Marcus returns to the abandoned gym where he used to train. The place is derelict, dusty, smelling of decay and forgotten dreams. But as he steps into the ring, he hears echoes of his former trainer's voice. A man named Sal who died 2 years ago. Sal's words from a decade past ring in his ears. "Champions aren't the ones who never fall, kid. They're the ones who get up so many times that falling becomes just another part of the rhythm." For the first time in 3 years, Marcus wraps his hands and hits the heavy bag. The first punch feels like betrayal. The second feels like memory. The third feels like coming home. Marcus commits to a 90-day transformation. But this isn't a montage of easy victories. He fails. Repeatedly. His body rebels, his lungs scream, his muscles tear, and he vomits from exhaustion after every session. His daughter watches from the sidelines, first with skepticism, then with guarded curiosity, and finally with something that looks like recognition. In the darkest moment, during a 5 a.m. run through freezing rain, Marcus collapses on the pavement, sobbing, ready to quit. But then, he hears his daughter's voice on the phone from that same hospital bed. "Dad, you always told me a champion never quits. Was that a lie?" He gets up. He always gets up now. Marcus has transformed not just his body, but his entire being. He enters a local charity boxing tournament, not to win, but to prove to Maya that comebacks are real. He's matched against a champion half his age, a man with everything to lose and nothing to prove. The fight is brutal. In the final round, Marcus is broken, bleeding, barely standing. The referee approaches to stop the fight. But Marcus looks at Maya in the front row, sees the light in her eyes that he thought was gone forever, and he roars. A sound that comes from somewhere deeper than the lungs, deeper than the soul, and he throws one final punch. It lands with the force of a man who has crawled through hell and brought his daughter back with him. He doesn't win the championship. He wins something far greater, his daughter's belief in him, and more importantly, her belief in herself. There are moments in a man's life when the universe conspires to show him exactly who he has become, and usually, those moments arrive in the most unremarkable of settings. A bathroom mirror, a stopped car, the end of a hallway. For Marcus Cole, the moment arrived at exactly 3:47 in the morning, on a Tuesday that tasted like regret and smelled like the bottom of a whiskey bottle that had been his companion for 1,095 nights, give or take a few that he'd blacked out completely. He stood there, one hand braced against the porcelain sink that was stained with years of neglect, the other holding a glass of amber liquid that he'd promised himself he wouldn't drink tonight, just like he'd promised himself every night for the past 3 years. And just like every night, the promise had crumbled somewhere between the setting of the sun and the rising of his demons. The bathroom light buzzed with that particular fluorescent hum that sounds like the dying gasp of electricity. casting his reflection in a sickly yellow pallor that made him look like a ghost who had forgotten how to die properly. And maybe that's exactly what he was. A ghost haunting his own life. A man who had once filled stadiums with roaring crowds that chanted his name like a prayer, now reduced to this, a hollowed-out shell of a human being who couldn't even open his daughter's birthday card because the sight of her handwriting would remind him of everything he had thrown away. The mirror didn't lie. Mirrors never do. They reflect back exactly what you put in front of them. And what Marcus put in front of that cheap, fog-stained mirror was a man who had given up on himself so completely that even his bones seemed to sag with the weight of his surrender. His eyes, once fierce and calculating, the eyes of a man who could read an opponent's next move before they even thought of it, now sat sunken in dark hollows that looked like bruises that never healed. His jaw, once sharp enough to cut glass, now softened into a jowl that spoke of too many late nights and too many excuses. His shoulders, once broad and powerful enough to carry the hopes of an entire city, now slumped forward like a man perpetually bracing for a blow he was too tired to dodge. And his hands, those hands that had thrown over 300 professional punches per round, hands that had been insured for millions of dollars, hands that had held his newborn daughter with such trembling tenderness that the nurses had cried. Those hands now shook with a tremor that came from somewhere deep in the nervous system, a physical manifestation of the spiritual decay that had been eating him alive from the inside out. But it wasn't the physical deterioration that broke him as he stood there in that bathroom. It wasn't the gut that had replaced his six-pack, or the way his breath came in shallow gasps from just the short walk from his bed to the sink, or even the constant dull ache in his right knee where the doctors had said he'd never fight again. No, what shattered him in that moment was something far more insidious, far more devastating. It was the look in his own eyes. Because when Marcus Cole stared into that mirror, he didn't see a former champion. He didn't see a man who had once been on the cover of Sports Illustrated, who had once been interviewed by every major network, who had once been considered one of the greatest middleweight boxers of his generation. He didn't see the man who had won 37 professional fights, 23 by knockout, and had never once been knocked down in his entire career. Not once, not ever. He didn't see any of that. What he saw was a stranger, a complete and utter stranger wearing his face, occupying his body, breathing his air, and somehow, this stranger had managed to steal everything that mattered from him. Not just his career, not just his fame, not just his money, but something infinitely more precious, his identity, his soul, his reason for getting out of bed in the morning, his ability to look at himself in the mirror and see anything other than a failure, dressed in the tattered remnants of a man who had once been somebody worth knowing. The thing about hitting rock bottom is that you don't usually realize you're there until you've been sitting on the floor for a while, getting comfortable with the debris. Marcus had been sitting on that floor for 3 years, and he'd gotten so comfortable that he'd stopped noticing the sharp edges of the broken pieces of his life. He'd stopped noticing how much it hurt to breathe, how every morning when he opened his eyes, there was a brief moment of blissful amnesia, a second or two where he didn't remember what he had lost. And then the weight of it all would crash down on him like a wave of cold black water, and he'd gasp and reach for the bottle, because the bottle was the only thing that made the drowning bearable. He'd stopped noticing the small indignities that had become the architecture of his daily existence, the way he avoided looking at his reflection in windows and storefronts, the way he'd cross the street if he saw someone who might recognize him, the way he deleted all his social media accounts and changed his phone number and told himself it was because he wanted peace, but really, deep down in the part of his soul that he'd walled off with barbed wire and concrete, he knew it was because he couldn't bear the shame of being a fallen hero, the shame of being a cautionary tale, the shame of being the guy at the bar who used to be somebody, the one everyone whispers about when he goes to the bathroom, the one whose downfall was so spectacular, so public, so complete, that even people who had never watched a single boxing match in their lives knew his name and the sad story that went with it. But tonight, at 3:47 in the morning, with the whiskey burning in his stomach and the fluorescent light buzzing like a trapped insect, and the empty silence of his apartment pressing in on him from all sides like a physical weight, Marcus Cole looked at his reflection, and he saw something that he hadn't seen in 3 years. He saw a question. It was there, flickering in the depths of his exhausted, bloodshot eyes, barely visible at first, like a star that you can only see if you look slightly to the side of it, a question so terrifying, so audacious, so completely insane that his brain tried to shut it down immediately, tried to drown it in the whiskey that was still sloshing around in his system, tried to bury it under the mountain of reasons why it was too late, why he was too old, too broken, too far gone. But the question refused to die. It refused to be silenced. It pulsed in his veins like a second heartbeat, beat against the walls of his skull like a prisoner demanding to be let out. And it was this. What if I'm not done? The thought was so foreign, so utterly alien to the landscape of his consciousness that for a moment, Marcus actually laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound that echoed off the cracked tiles of his bathroom and mingled with the drip of a leaky faucet that he'd been meaning to fix for months. What if he wasn't done? What a ridiculous, absurd, laughable notion. Of course he was done. He'd been done the moment the doctor had looked at his MRI results and shaken his head with that particular brand of professional sympathy that says, "I'm sorry," without actually saying the words. He'd been done the moment his promoter had called to tell him they were voiding his contract, the moment his sponsors had pulled their endorsements, the moment his trainer Sal had looked at him with tears in his eyes and said, "Kid, there's nothing left to prove." He'd been done the moment his wife had packed her bags and taken Maya and walked out of his life, not with anger or accusations, but with a quiet sadness that was somehow so much worse, because it meant she'd given up on him long before she'd actually left. He'd been done in 1,000 different ways, 1,000,000 different moments, each one a small death that had accumulated into the slow, agonizing funeral of everything he had ever been. So what was this? What was this insane, impossible, utterly delusional thought that was creeping into his consciousness like a burglar breaking into a house that had been abandoned for years? What right did his reflection have to look at him with that glimmer of something that looked almost like hope? But the question wouldn't let go. It was relentless, like a dog with a bone, like a child tugging at your sleeve, like an opponent who just won't stay down, no matter how many times you hit him. What if I'm not done? And with that question came a flood of memories, unbidden and unwelcome, crashing over him like a tsunami of everything he had been and everything he had thrown away. He remembered the first time he'd ever put on a pair of boxing gloves. He was 8 years old. His father had just left, and his mother, desperate and broke and trying to keep her son out of trouble, had signed him up for the local youth boxing program. He remembered the feeling of those gloves on his hands, heavy and awkward, and yet somehow, impossibly, like they belonged there. He remembered the first time he'd stepped into a ring, the smell of sweat and blood and liniment, the roar of the crowd that sounded like the ocean, the feeling of his heart pounding in his chest, like it was trying to break free of his ribs. He remembered the first time he'd been punched in the face, The shock of it, the pain, the humiliation, and then the fire that had ignited in his gut. The refusal to stay down, the absolute certainty that he would never, ever let anyone hit him again without paying for it in blood. He remembered the first time he'd won a championship, the weight of the belt around his waist, the flash of cameras, the screaming fans, the way his mother had cried in the front row, clutching a photograph of his father and whispering, You see what our boy did." He remembered the birth of his daughter, the way she'd fit in the crook of his arm, like she'd been designed specifically for that purpose, the way she'd looked up at him with those impossibly blue eyes. And he'd made a silent vow to protect her from everything, to be the kind of man she could be proud of, to never let her see him weak or broken or afraid. And then he remembered the accident, the torn ligament that had felt like a gunshot in his knee, the surgery that had been supposed to fix everything, the rehab that had been supposed to bring him back, and the slow, creeping realization that he would never be the same again. He remembered the first time he'd thrown a punch after the surgery and felt something give way inside him, something that couldn't be fixed with more surgery or more rehab or more hope. He remembered the first time he'd reached for the bottle instead of the punching bag, the first time he told himself it was just for today, just to take the edge off, just to get through the night. And he remembered the first time he'd realized that he'd become exactly the kind of man he'd sworn he would never be. A coward, a quitter, a man who had given up on himself and in doing so, had given up on everyone who had ever believed in him. The weight of those memories pressed down on Marcus's shoulders like a physical force, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse right there, might sink to the bathroom floor and curl up, and let the darkness take him completely. He'd done it before, after all. He'd spent so much time on that floor, in that darkness, that it had become almost comfortable, almost familiar, almost like home. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the darkness felt suffocating instead of soothing. Tonight, the bottle in his hand felt like poison instead of medicine. Tonight, when he looked at his reflection, he saw not just the ruin of what he had been, but the ghost of what he could still become. And that ghost was furious. That ghost was screaming at him from behind his eyes, from somewhere deep in his marrow, from the part of him that had never quite died, no matter how much he tried to kill it. That ghost was pounding on the walls of his psyche, demanding to be let out, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding that he stop this pathetic parade of self-destruction and remember who the hell he actually was. "Who am I?" Marcus whispered to his reflection, his voice hoarse from dessous and whiskey and the years of silent screaming that he'd done inside his own head. But the reflection didn't answer. The reflection just stared back at him with those hollow eyes, those sunken cheeks, that pathetic excuse for a man who had let everything slip through his fingers like water. "Who am I?" he asked again, louder this time, his voice cracking on the last word. And then something strange happened. The reflection changed. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, like a shift in the light or a trick of the eye. But the more Marcus stared, the more he saw. Not the broken man in front of him, but the man he used to be. The man with the fierce eyes and the sharp jaw and the shoulders that could carry the weight of the world. The man who had never been knocked down. The man who had faced opponents twice his size and never once backed up, never once blinked, never once doubted that he would walk out of that ring with his hand raised in victory. The man who had been a father, a husband, a champion, a symbol of everything that was possible when you refused to give up. That man was still there, buried under the layers of whiskey and defeat and self-pity. But he was there, and he was looking at Marcus with something that looked almost like disappointment, almost like judgment, almost like a challenge. And in that moment, Marcus realized something that would change the entire trajectory of his life. Something so simple and yet so profound that it almost made him laugh again. But this time with something that was almost joy instead of bitterness. He realized that the man in the mirror wasn't a stranger. He had never been a stranger. He was Marcus Cole, and Marcus Cole was a fighter. And fighters don't stay down. Fighters get back up. Fighters keep swinging. Fighters don't let a busted knee, or a few bad years, or a million mistakes define them. Because being a fighter isn't about winning or losing. It's about refusing to quit. It's about standing up when everything inside you is screaming at you to stay down. It's about looking at your reflection when you hate what you see and saying, "I'm not done yet." And Marcus Cole, for all his failures, for all his mistakes, for all his years of drowning in whiskey and regret, was still a fighter. He would always be a fighter. It was in his blood, in his bones, in the very DNA of his being. It was the thing that had made him a champion in the first place, and it was the thing that would save him now if he let it. The glass in his hand felt different now, heavier, more significant. He looked at the amber liquid inside it, the whiskey that had been his companion for 1,000 nights, his lover, his friend, his executioner. And for the first time in 3 years, he didn't want it. He didn't want the numbness it promised, the oblivion it offered, the temporary relief from the pain of being alive. Because the pain of being alive, he suddenly understood, was the only thing that reminded him that he was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something other than the slow, creeping death of his own spirit. The pain was proof. The pain was evidence that somewhere, deep down, there was still a man worth fighting for. The pain was the voice of the ghost in his reflection, the ghost that was screaming at him to wake up, to remember, to fight. Marcus set the glass down on the counter with a clink that seemed to echo through the silence of the apartment like a gunshot. He turned his gaze back to the mirror, back to that reflection that he had avoided for so long, and he looked at himself. Really looked, not with the eyes of shame or self-loathing, but with the eyes of a man who was about to make a decision. The most important decision of his life. The decision that would determine whether he would continue to exist in this half-life, this limbo of mediocrity and regret, or whether he would claw his way back to being the man he had once been, the man he was still capable of becoming. He didn't know how. He didn't know if it was even possible. His body was broken, his spirit was shattered, his life was in ruins. The mountain in front of him was so tall that it scraped the sky, so steep that it seemed utterly impossible to climb. But as he stood there, staring at his reflection, he felt something stir in his chest, something that had been dormant for so long that he'd almost forgotten it existed. It was the fire, the old fire, the fire that had burned in him since he was 8 years old, the fire that had carried him through every fight, every setback, every moment of doubt and despair. The fire that had made him a champion, the fire that he had thought was dead, extinguished by the whiskey and the shame and the years of giving up. But it wasn't dead. It had never been dead. It had just been waiting, waiting for him to remember, waiting for him to look in the mirror and see not a failure, but a fighter, waiting for him to ask the question that would change everything. What if I'm not done? Marcus Cole took a deep breath, the first deep breath he'd taken in years, and he let it fill his lungs completely, the way he used to before a fight, when he was centering himself, grounding himself, preparing himself for battle. And then he spoke to his reflection, not in a whisper this time, but in a voice that was stronger than it had been in years, a voice that carried the weight of everything he had been and everything he was about to become. "I'm not done," he said, and the words hung in the air between him and the mirror, shimmering with possibility, glowing with hope. They were just words, just sounds, just vibrations in the air. But they were also something more. They were a declaration, a promise, a vow that he would not let this be the end of his story. He would not let the last chapter of Marcus Cole's life be written in whiskey and regret. He would not let his daughter grow up believing that her father was a quitter. He would not let the ghost of his past haunt him into oblivion. He would fight. He would get back up. He would climb that impossible mountain, one handhold at a time, one breath at a time, one moment of sheer, stubborn, undeniable willpower at a time. And he would not stop. He would never stop. Because that's what fighters do. They don't stop. They don't quit. They don't give up. They keep going, keep pushing, keep fighting until the very end. And even then, they find a way to keep fighting a little longer. The fluorescent light buzzed. The faucet dripped. The whiskey sat on the counter, untouched. A silent testament to a promise that had just been made. And in the bathroom of a rundown apartment in a forgotten corner of the city, a man who had been dead for 3 years opened his eyes and breathed his first breath of truly living. It wasn't a dramatic rebirth, not yet. There were no angelic choirs, no sudden beams of light from the heavens, no swelling orchestral music to mark the moment. There was just a man and a mirror and a decision that would lead him down a path of unimaginable pain and struggle, a path that would test every ounce of his resolve, a path that would demand more from him than he had ever given to anything in his entire life. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that Marcus Cole had made a choice, the choice to fight, the choice to believe, the choice to look at his reflection and see not the ghost of what he had been, but the promise of what he could still become. The choice to ask the question and to answer it with everything he had. What if I'm not done? The answer, whispered into the silence of the early morning hours, was this: then I'll start again. And somewhere, deep in the depths of his broken, battered, but unbreakable heart, Marcus Cole felt the first flicker of something he had thought was lost forever, the feeling of being alive.